Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Cook. I am the miller at Foster's Mill, a working windmill near Cambridge in the UK. I am a member of the Craft of the Miller steering group, and it's a real privilege to be part of the conversation today to introduce the topic for our program this afternoon. So, as you're aware, we're here to explore health, safety, managing risks in our mill. Let's think about why we're having this conversation. Well, the reality is that traditional mills are industrial machines. And we use this name of heritage because, of course, we're working with historic buildings. But in reality, these are machines with large moving parts worked by people and in many cases producing products that create dust and indeed working with other substances which today are considered harmful to health. As we're all aware, sadly, people have accidents, and some of those accidents in recent history have been tragic. None of us plan to have accidents. We have risk assessments, we have procedures, we offer training to our employees and our volunteers, yet accidents still happen. Equally, of course, we're all looking to maintain our mills in a way which respects and indeed fosters or promotes the historic fabric and the cultural heritage which are part of our mills, the history and the products that we produce. We're not here to adapt them to become modern factories. So we have a huge responsibility. We need somehow to work together, to develop, to share best practice. We need to understand the legislation which applies in the rest of industry and which, of course, would be applied to our working spaces if a serious accident were to happen. If we don't have these conversations, there is a serious risk that things will go wrong. And so the point of today's conference is to explore a range of topics which come into this area of safety and managing risk. Now, I and my colleagues who are on the steering group do not have all the answers. And so this presentation now is about raising some questions. And we're going to then be breaking into smaller groups so that you can share your experience and collectively we can develop some best practice and answers and learn from each other. So what are we going to explore? Well, we're going to explore some key areas: how we manage flour dust, how we avoid fire risks in our mills, how we maintain the milling environment with good hygiene. So all of those factors are, of course, very prevalent for working flour mills. But there are some other factors we're going to explore which are relevant to many other mills. So in particular, how we lift safely. For corn mills, then we have stone cranes. But in all our other mills, we use sack hoists. We lift a range of machinery. Equally, of course, we lift millstones. So we're using lifting devices for a range of different activities. So I'm going to propose that over the course of this afternoon, these are our key topics. My colleague Jippe is going to give a presentation specifically on working with stone cranes. You will see that shortly. Our aim is to explore the best practice that exists in our mills, to learn from each other, and we're going to do that in the breakout rooms that will follow these presentations. So please make some notes, be ready to share your examples, your good practice, your concerns, and hopefully your ideas. Well, first of all, let's remind ourselves of some of the legislation which applies. Now, of course, each of our countries have different pieces of legislation. But given that a significant number of the people who are on our conference this afternoon are coming from within Europe, there are many countries which have shared legislative frameworks. So I can reel off lots of pieces of legislation: the Chemical Agents Directive, the ATEX Workplace Directive, etc. But fundamentally, these directives are designed to ensure that workplaces are safe, especially from factors like dust and other things which are dangerous to human health and can potentially cause explosions. And especially for those of us involved with corn mills, these, of course, are factors which we are dealing with day to day. Let's look at some of the issues in corn mills about managing flour dust. Now, you can see my video that I'm sharing with you right now. This is my own mill working away. We have our traditional flour spout, and as you can see, flour dust is going everywhere. Flour is classified as a substance hazardous to health. It's a risk, and there is a risk from me inhaling flour dust. There are potential risks in terms of skin conditions, and of course people that suffer from other lung conditions, for example asthma, and also risks for people who have things like gluten intolerance. There's also a technical risk in relation to dust explosion, where very large quantities of flour dust are in the atmosphere. Now, we're going to look at the issues around flour dust in a moment, but if we're working in a flour mill, these are factors that we are having to manage. Our colleagues in the wider flour milling industry have for many years taken these factors extremely seriously. Here we have a document which was produced by the National Association of British and Irish Millers, the trade body that represents our millers. There are a range of pieces of legislation which are specific to the issues of dust in the atmosphere. Now, these are pieces of legislation which apply to our mills. And yet, when we look back in our history, there are virtually no examples where flour dust has caused explosions in traditional mills, certainly, I think, over the last 100 years. So, on the one hand, we have legislation which applies to us, and we are expected to be working with and responding to. And yet, if we look at the actual reality, the evidence from a period of time, then it would appear that these risks are risks which are managed in different ways. Looking specifically at the risk of flour dust, if you look at the technical data, and you can see I've put some information on the slide here, if we take what's known as the lower explosion limit, which as you can see there is 60 grams of flour dust per cubic meter of air, in a space which is 75 cubic meters, which I suggest represents certainly some of our larger corn mills, let's say the stone floor in one of our larger corn mills, you would actually need 4.5 kilos of flour to be dispersed in the air, in the atmosphere, at any one time before there would technically be enough dust to cause a risk of explosion. Now, you and I have been in traditional mills. There is a large amount of natural ventilation. There is air moving through wind and water mills all the time. And perhaps this explains why there are next to no examples of explosions in traditional mills where flour dust has been the cause of that explosion. Whereas in modern roller milling mills, there are multiple examples where flour dust has caused explosions. So we have a challenge. How do we both manage risks and also demonstrate to people who are in authority that the risk is very low? And these are issues certainly which we're now dealing with in the UK. What can we do to minimize the dust in the atmosphere? Well, of course, there are multiple things that we can do, and I just share a few examples in the slide right now. The simple thing of covering the spout, the same spout that you saw in the video a few moments ago. By putting a cloth cover over the spout, I reduce the amount of flower dust coming into the atmosphere. Here's another mill. This is a water mill, Mill Green Mill in the UK, where for a variety of reasons, they have actually installed equipment to remove air from the environment. And you can see in the video I'm about to show the elements which literally draw air. So ventilation, which sucks air, sucks the flower dust away from the working space to minimize the risk that the miller is going to ingest flower dust and to minimize the flower dust in the atmosphere. So take a look at this. There you can see the vent very close to the spout where the meal comes down from the millstones. And there we're looking at the ducts, the air ducts sucking the flower dust away from the working areas in the mill. They have monitors to ensure that the atmosphere is clear of flower dust. Apparently very useful if you've got a handful of flower dust, it sucks it up and takes it away. Now, of course, very few mills have such facilities. But what do you do in your mill to minimize flower dust and to ensure a good, healthy environment for the people that work in your mill and equally the people who visit your mill? Of course, flower dust is not just a risk in terms of explosion and in terms of our human health. There are many other organisms that enjoy living in flower dust, and a few careful pictures in my own mill reveal one or two places where perhaps we have not cleaned as well as we could. What happens if you put your camera in your meal spout? It's an interesting question. I have to say the spout that you can see on the left-hand side is one that is not currently in use. But as we all know, if we don't clean, then we create spaces where flower dust sits, and especially things like mill moth will start to lay eggs, pupae, and then start to become a pest in the mill. So what do we do? What are your cleaning procedures in order that your mill is as clean as possible? Vacuum cleaning. Well, if we're going to clean, we need to have a machine to clean. And this is increasingly presenting questions because from a legislative perspective, then there is a requirement to ensure that your vacuum cleaner is going to minimize the risk of dust explosion. Is that a real risk? That is an important question. Do you use a domestic vacuum cleaner like the one in the bottom picture? Or do you invest a significant amount of money in a specialist vacuum cleaner which is built and designed to minimize the risk of explosions? These are questions that some of our mills in the UK are now asking and that we're being asked to explore and provide advice on. So what are your thoughts and experiences? Of course, hygiene is also critical, especially for those mills that are producing a product for human consumption. Now, how and where do you pack your flour? Do you create a dedicated building and a space which is purpose designed? And what are the things, the areas that you're focusing on in order to ensure that you're able to pack your product, maintaining a high level of product hygiene for your customers? How do you meet the requirements of environmental health or the council, the bodies which regulate food supply in your country? Well, at my mill, we decided to build a dedicated space because we needed more space. And so we created a space that I'm going to show you now. Now, other mills, of course, are packing flour within the traditional milling space. But what, in wherever you pack flour, do we do to cover and explore particular areas. So let's take a look. Well, first of all, let's think about the floor. How do we make sure that we have a floor which can be cleaned, which is well maintained, which avoids flour getting stuck, and therefore a space for microbes to grow? What about the walls? What can we do to ensure that there is minimal dust to fall into our packing space? Our ceiling area, how is that secure again to prevent things falling into our flour? What about our lighting to ensure that there is no risk of anything breaking and getting into the flour product? The benches that we use stainless steel benches, but of course that's not relevant for many mill environments. So these, of course, are questions that we all have to deal with. But here's an opportunity to share our best practice, what's expected of us, and how do we respond to that? You'll tell us shortly. Dust masks. Do you expect your volunteers, if you employ people, do you expect your employees to wear dust masks when they are working close to a flour meal spout, when they are packing flour, for example? Here in the picture, you can see a training session that I ran a few weeks ago, and you can see that the trainees were wearing dust masks as we worked close by the flour meal spout as the flour dust was coming into our faces. But what's your best practice? What do you do in your mill? Now moving on to the final element that I'm going to explore in this introduction, which is the whole question of safety when lifting. Now, there again are multiple pieces of legislation which cover the requirements of lifting gear, and they all apply to the milling environment. Now, HIPAA is going to talk about the stone crane shortly, but let's look a little bit more widely. These requirements require that equipment is suitable for the use that we are making of it. They require that equipment is regularly inspected and that maintenance, which is mandatory, is carried out. They expect that we take specific precautions when we are using the equipment to ensure the safety of volunteers or workers. And employees must ensure that the workers are adequately trained to use the equipment. So what does that look like in your mill? Well, most mills, certainly corn mills, have a sack hoist. Some, like the one you can see in the picture here, is a traditional chain, often a chain which has been there for many years. So how do you test that chain? How frequently do you test that chain to ensure that it meets the requirements, that it's safe, and that you have evidence that it meets those requirements and the relevant legislation? In a corn mill, you're going to be lifting millstones, and as I say, HIPAA is going to look at that shortly. You will either have a stone crane or you will be using a chain hoist to lift your millstones, again, as you can see in the pictures. So these are some of the questions that we're faced with in order to ensure that our mills are able to work in the way that they were intended, that we can have volunteers or employees working in our mills, and that we can show people what our mills were intended to produce or what they were intended to do, and continue that tradition. So there's a little bit of an introduction. I've raised some questions, and we're going to shortly go into our breakout rooms, and that will be a time where your facilitators will be asking you about your approach, your experience, and how we can collectively start to share best practice in these areas. Thank you.